car ads from the 50s through the 70s, the car was always represented as a kind of means to an end. That is, a couple would get into a car and drive to some beautiful place where they presumably have a utopian experience. Now the driver is always alone with his car, and a woman will often be running her hand lovingly over the car's surface. So the car itself is actually a sex object. That's fairly recent.
I don't know. I remember jokes in high school about women who were worried that the guys were more into their cars than they were into the women.
Well,
I mean, there was a kind of, it's not a homoerotic charge, but it's like a men amongst themselves kind of thing,
right,
where cars are more interesting and women are just irritating.
But you don't.
Separate, let's not argue about the car
Okay.
thing.
It's not just car, it's commodity.
Right. I mean, Europe is really interesting, right? Because they've been commenting on the death of desire across the West since the 90s. The news media spasm only hit the U.S. in the 2002-03. That's when sort of What to Do when his sex drive takes a nosedive hit Cosmo also. And I think Europeans are much more interested in exactly how the overstim makes everybody be unaroused. And the response to that is not only to say, oh, well, people need now midget on donkey or something ever more intense, but I actually think that the really interesting conversation is that love has come back into the conversation. And that, yes, the most physically intense orgasm can still leave you feeling utterly empty inside. And that's a really interesting human phenomenon, that the yearning for romance and explosive emotional intensity persists, despite all efforts to pimp it, to eulogize it, to market it, to do all that kind of other stuff. It doesn't go away. The human desire for passionate intensity doesn't go away, and that's actually a hugely comforting thing to me. But it also worries me a great deal that that's where the conservatives are finding the voice to speak and trying to offer pseudo-solutions, and progressives are not able to celebrate human diversity, talk about the complexity of desire and the unruliness of that, and actually not make people feel crappy when they can't find that, but also not worry so much that it's going to disappear. And I think what's happening now, if you look at all the other books that are out there on religion and sex, what I notice is that everyone sort of agreed on the terms of debate, that there's hookup culture, and that's somehow meaningless and disgusting, and then there's meaningful sex. And we need to not mystify sex and say, oh, it has to be meaningful, it must be intimate and serving the relationship, because that, I think, is another kind of policing. And yet, on the other hand, say, yeah, there can be amazing romantic sex also in a gay bathhouse, right? There can be amazing experiences people have in their lifetime, and it might be with a stranger. And that needs to be defended, too. And that's it's a different moral position, right? It's a third way that says, yes, I can see that there's this numbing that's going on in consumer culture, but I also see human beings every now and then still having something amazing happening, and that's to be celebrated.
We seem to be focusing on these sort of broader social and mass psychological attitudes towards sex that are being promulgated by the media, or various religious elements, cultural elements. But it seems that a lot of what's in the background here is this fear, like we were discussing before, Adorno, and whether the best way to be anti-fascist or anti-Nazi in post-war is to re-Christianize or for sexual liberalization, etc. And I'm wondering if, in these European conferences you attend, perhaps this theme is in the background of fascism and sexuality, when right in front of your noses now you have the U.S. and NATO and the remilitarized Germany and the former Axis countries of Europe actually engaging in some well-documented horrific sexual trafficking of women, children, rapes, abductions in Kosovo, for example, in trafficking of women from Eastern Europe towards Germany, the Netherlands, etc. So I'm wondering if this comes up at the conference, is that we're actually seeing this sort of re-fascism, in part led by the U.S. and NATO, right before your eyes.
Right. Well, I mean, fascism is a constant presence in any thoughtful European conversation about sexuality or sexual politics, right? They're so aware of that in their background because that's their touchstone for how they figured out how to have a different way of morality. I mean, the trauma in our country is slavery, right? Utterly sexualized, utterly horrific, torturous system. We haven't processed it. The world didn't force us to process it. The world forced the Germans to process what they did. So one of the dramas in this country is that we haven't come to terms with that. But I would say, yes, one of the weird things that goes on in the conversations in Europe is how can it be, under the Bush administration, right, that torture is considered moral, but teen sex is immoral? How did that happen? That's mind-blowing for Europeans because they had a fight where they said, no, nudity and free love, that's not immoral. Auschwitz is immoral. So murder, racism, Vietnam War, that was that generation. They looked like, this is outrageous. What's wrong with sex? But the Americans made that connection for a while, but didn't have the same moral intensity to it that anybody living in post-fascist Europe did. And so what happens now in the discussions around sex trafficking and the UN troops and the raping and the sexual violence in Abu Ghraib and all those kinds of discussions is that the most thoughtful Europeans say we cannot have repressive sexual morality as the response to this violence. We need to go to a system where we defend the right to desired sexuality and the right to protection from sexual violence. We have to go to the individual. And individuals have the right to be different. They don't all have to fit into the happy little mommy-daddy package. And that's the difference in the conversation, right? So too often in the United States, and even Obama has made this mistake, they lump together prostitution and sex trafficking, right? When what you should do is lump trafficking together with slavery. Prostitution is a consensual exchange. We can talk about the coercive conditions of poverty and lack of options and so on, but basically one should make distinctions between voluntary prostitution and trafficking, but too often, and literally American law does not make that distinction, right? The PEPFAR program that Bush just got reauthorized in 2008 forces every NGO that takes American money through USAID to sign a pledge that it is not only opposed to trafficking but also to prostitution.
How do you tell the difference? It's all very vague and blurry.
It's not that vague and blurry.
Is prostitution really consensual?
Yes. Yes, I think I urge you to read a book called Temporarily Yours, which is one of the best recent studies. It's by Elizabeth Bernstein.
That's a very controversial position you're taking.
I do. But you know what? That's what happens when you study history. You learn that obviously all through the 20th century, many people who are married feel like they're selling sexual services for economic security. So that's a blurry line too. And the only way people have figured out to try to distinguish, and honestly, the Christian sex advice that I read is testimony enough to the amount of emotional wasteland and lack of mutuality that also exists within marriage. So yeah, I think that it's a controversial position, but it's one that has found its form and its expression in the European Court of Human Rights, and they've thought it out fairly well.
But just my last question, what minimum age would you say would be the right age of consent when you could be a prostitute?
I'm really happy with...
Good point. There's children.
Go ahead. Do I want to? I think the age of consent should be 16. For desired sex for prostitute, I think probably 18 is a good idea.
There's a lot of data about that. That's not
Geez, people are so shy. I guess it's because of this.
No, she thinks it's. Go ahead, tell me a lot of data.
I mean, there's a lot of data that suggests that that there's a lot of data now that we have neuroimaging to suggest that emerging adulthood, people are not fully adults until they're about 24. So I disagree with that people fully understand, because I don't think they do.
So nobody should be having sex until they're...
No, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that people that are trafficked for prostitution at 16, that's not okay.
She was making a distinction between trafficking and prostitution, and I think that's what's being lost here. Correct me if I'm wrong, Dagmar, but you're saying prostitution is not the same as trafficking, and the problem is that we throw them together instead of putting trafficking in with slavery, which is where it belongs. That was my argument.
Yeah.
And I was arguing that if you're old enough to kill people in the Army, you should be old enough to choose who to have sex with.
Well, I'm not agreeing that 18 is old enough to kill people either. I'm not agreeing, I mean, by what?
Wayne, do you want to say something?
Oh, I just wanted to throw in one thing. I don't know how many people are aware of it, that there's an American territory where enforced prostitution is institutionalized, and it's a territory of the United States, and that the Republicans, particularly Tom DeLay, were very concerned with protecting the right of this system to exist. It's called the Mariana Islands. It's a territory that's held over from World War II. And they bring prostitutes in there and force them to work there. And they also, if the prostitutes get pregnant, they force them to have abortions, and that's also true of the slave labor they have in the factories there, which is also imported.